There are three brothers who hunted the same stretch of Black Mountain in Harlan County, Kentucky for nearly 30 years. They were not researchers. They were not investigators. They were hunters, Appalachian men whose calendars were organized around the October deer season, who found a dogman on that mountain in the fall of 1993 and could not stop going back. Two of those brothers are dead. The third is the reason this story exists. There are things Wade will not say out loud, not because he has forgotten them, because the words still do not come cleanly, even now. More than 3 decades after the first time one of his brothers came off that mountain with something broken behind his eyes. He will tell you about the tracks. He will tell you about the sounds. He will even tell you about the night. All three of them stood on a ridgeline in the dark and understood, with a clarity that only extreme fear produces, that whatever they were looking at had been watching them far longer than they had been watching it. What he will not do is name it the way researchers name it. He calls it the thing. Has called it that for 30 years, and when you hear him say it over the phone, the word carries more weight than any formal taxonomy could improve on. We agreed to change his name. He has no interest in attention, or in being believed, or disbelieved. He agreed to let us tell this story for one reason, and it took him a while to say it plainly. He said his brothers are gone, and someone should know what they saw. That was his reason. No pride in the telling, no desire to be vindicated by anyone. Just the simple insistence that two men who spent the better part of 3 decades returning to a stretch of Kentucky mountain because something lived there that they could not explain should not disappear without a record. We will call him Wade. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Dogman accounts from the Appalachian Highlands carry a depth we are only beginning to understand, and this one runs deeper than most. The first thing you need to understand about the three brothers is that they were hunters the way some men are farmers or soldiers, not weekenders or dabblers. Hunting was the organizing principle of their lives from the time their father took them into the woods above Lynch, Kentucky, in the early 1960s, when Lonnie, the oldest, was barely old enough to carry a single-shot .22. Their father worked for U.S. Steel at the Lynch mine, the same operation that had built the town block by block starting in 1917, and he carried with him the particular relationship with the land that men in that valley developed across generations of working inside the mountain by day and walking its surface by night. The boys inherited that relationship without examining it. They hunted the way they breathed. Because it was what you did in Harlan County if you grew up when and where they grew up. Lonnie was the oldest. He was 63 years old when he died in January of 2017. For most of his adult life, he worked as a surveyor for a coal company operating in Leslie and Harlan counties, which put him on exactly the kind of remote, steep ground where few other people went. He was comfortable at elevation in bad weather. He could read topographic maps the way other men read a newspaper. He had spent his working career on the ridgelines and benchlands above the three forks of the Cumberland River, and he had the particular knowledge that accumulates in a person who crosses the same ground repeatedly across decades. He knew where the drainage patterns changed. He knew which hollows held cold air all summer and which ones opened to the south and ran dry by August. He had been in every named and unnamed fold of that country, and he had never encountered anything in 4 decades of working and hunting those hills that prepared him for what he found on Black Mountain in the fall of 1993. Cecil was the middle brother. He was 61 years old when he passed in the spring of 2020. He had worked maintenance for the Harlan County school system for over 2 decades, the kind of steady institutional job that let him take his vacation time in October and November without friction. Cecil was the quietest of the three by considerable margin. Wade described him as the brother who watched while the other two talked, who filed things away and said nothing until he was certain, and who, once certain, could not be moved. He had served 2 years in the Army before coming home to Harlan County, and the experience had given him a precision in his thinking that the mountains confirmed and sharpened. Cecil kept a journal, composition books from the school supply closet, filled with neat handwriting that documented 30 years of returns to Black Mountain in a detail that no outside researcher would have known to ask for. Those notebooks are the other reason Wade agreed to talk. He has them. He has read them a dozen times since Cecil died. The entries covering the years between 1993 and 2016 read like a case file assembled by someone who understood that the evidence would outlast the people who found it. Wade is the youngest. He is in his mid-60s now, retired from a career running heavy equipment for a road construction company out of Middlesboro. He lives in the same county where he was born. He has not been back to Black Mountain since the fall of 2021, and he says he will not go back again. Not out of fear, though he would be the first to tell you the fear is still there. Out of something he describes as respect, and means with precision. What the 30 years on Black Mountain did to Wade's daily life is harder to account for than the simple behavioral changes that followed his brother's deaths. The changes started before Lonnie died and deepened after Cecil. He stopped night fishing, which had been a regular summer activity since his 20s. He knows that what is on Black Mountain has never followed anyone back to town. But the knowing does not fully reach the part of him that decides whether to wade into a dark creek at midnight with a headlamp. He gave his fishing gear away and moved on. He no longer hunts in those Harlan County hills anymore. He said that is the one that costs him the most to acknowledge. A man who was in the woods behind his father at the age of 9, who organized his adult life around October, who built his primary relationship with his brothers around the shared act of going into the hills together every fall, does not hunt anymore. He has licenses to hunt property he owns outside Middlesboro. He has not used them. He said the problem is not that the woods feel dangerous. The problem is that they feel occupied. You cannot look at a piece of ground the same way once you understand that something lives on it that knew you were there before you parked your truck. Black Mountain is the highest point in Kentucky at 4,145 feet. It sits on the line between Harlan County and Wise County, Virginia, running roughly northeast from the community of Lynch on the Kentucky side toward the Pound Gap area on the Virginia side. The mountain is not a single peak but a ridgeline, a long wall of sandstone and shale running the better part of 12 miles along the state border, thickly forested with red oak, chestnut oak, hemlock, and yellow poplar on the slopes, and wind-stunted hardwoods at the summit ridge where the weather comes off the Virginia plateau in November, carrying a cold that has nothing gentle in it. The Martins Fork of the Cumberland River drains the north face before cutting west through Benham and Lynch toward the main river. The Clover Fork drains further west. Between those two drainages and the mountain's ridgeline is a country of steep hollows, old logging grades, and second-growth forest that has been recovering from generations of timbering since the early 1900s. The roads that reached into it were built for coal, and most of them have been unmaintained for years, reverting to creek beds and deer paths. Lonnie had hunted the slopes above the Martins Fork drainage his entire adult life. He knew where the deer ran. He knew the game trails that crossed the ridgeline and dropped into Virginia on the eastern side. He had set trail cameras on the old logging grades when trail cameras became affordable in the mid-90s, had accumulated years of whitetail and turkey and black bear observations on that piece of ground, and had never once captured anything he could not identify. That changed in the fall of 1993. Lonnie was sitting in a portable stand about 16 feet up a red oak on a benchland above the Martins Fork drainage, about a mile and a half into the woods from the end of an old coal haul road. It was a Tuesday morning in the second week of November. The rut was running. He had watched a small buck chase a doe through the understory below him shortly after first light, and then the forest had gone quiet the way it does mid-morning when the deer bed and the squirrels settle, and the only sound is wind moving through the canopy. He had been in that tree for 3.5 hours. He was comfortable, patient. The benchland was his most productive stand site, and he knew every inch of it from 20 years of use. What pulled his attention was not a sound he heard. It was a sound that stopped. The creek below the bench had been running audibly all morning, a low background noise that he had stopped consciously registering within the first 20 minutes. At some point between 9 and 9:30, he realized the creek was the only thing he could hear, not a single bird call in any direction, which, on a November morning in eastern Kentucky, is not a silence you encounter by chance. He turned his head slowly and scanned the timber below him. Nothing visible in the understory. Nothing moving, but the quality of the silence had a character that put the hair up on his arms, and Lonnie had been in these woods long enough to trust that kind of reaction. He saw the head first. It was moving between two stands of hemlock about 60 yards downhill from his position, at the edge of a laurel thicket that bordered the creek. The head cleared the laurel tops by a significant margin, which told him immediately that whatever he was looking at was not moving on 4 legs. Laurel thickets in that hollow, ran chest high on a standing man. What he was seeing was head and shoulders above that line, which put it at a height that no animal in the Eastern Kentucky Field Guide produces while walking on all fours. He raised his binoculars. The detail that locked into Lonnie's memory and never left it, the detail that Cecil recorded in the first of the composition books in a handwriting Wade describes as unusually controlled even for Cecil, was the head shape. Lonnie was a surveyor. He worked in degrees and distances and proportions, and the wrongness of what he was looking at registered the way a structural error registers in a man who has built things for a living. The muzzle extended too far forward. The ears were pointed and standing upright, set at the top of the skull rather than on the sides. The head was tilted slightly downward as it moved, the posture of something reading the ground, working scent. The body was dark, deep brown or black. He could not be certain in the filtered November light, under a canopy that was mostly bare at that elevation. The shoulders were broad. The gait was bipedal, unhurried, covering ground the way a man covers ground when he knows exactly where he is going and has no reason to hurry. Lonnie sat in that tree for 8 seconds after raising the binoculars. He counted them later. He said he counted because counting gave him something to do with his mind while the rest of him refused to process what he was looking at. On the 8th second, the figure turned its head away from him and changed course, moving uphill along the edge of the laurel thicket and into heavier timber. Within 30 seconds, it was gone. He sat in that stand for another 2 hours. He did not raise his rifle. He told his brothers later that the thought of raising his rifle had not entered his mind. Fear had been part of it, and the adrenaline was considerable. But the thought was wrong the moment it formed. He said the way the thing moved was what stopped him. He said it moved like something that belonged there more than he did, and that some part of him recognized that before any other part of him had finished deciding what he was looking at. He climbed down when he was certain it was gone, walked to the spot where he had seen it, and found the ground torn up where the laurel thicket met the creek bank. Large impressions in the mud, canid, at least in their basic morphology, with distinct pad structures and claw marks forward of the toes. But the size was wrong, and the stride, across a stretch of soft ground where 3 prints were clear enough to measure with his tape, came out to just under 4 feet between impressions. He did not tell Cecil or Wade about it that day. He drove back to Lynch and ate a sandwich at a diner on Main Street and tried to organize what he had seen into something that made sense. He could not. When he got home, he called Cecil. That conversation, which Wade was not part of but which Cecil wrote about in the first notebook, lasted just under 2 hours. By the end of it, Lonnie had decided he was going back the following weekend and wanted both brothers with him, not to hunt the thing, to see if it was real. Because the alternative, that he had seen it and it was real, required the agreement of at least one other person before he was prepared to accept it as fact. That is how Lonnie processed things. He needed a second data point. He got considerably more than that. What the 3 brothers documented over the next 3 decades in Harlan County represents one of the most sustained series of encounters at a single location in any part of the eastern United States. They did not become researchers or investigators. They came back to Black Mountain because they had been hunting it their whole lives and because the thing was there, and because none of them could fully accept what they had seen without continuing to see it. Wade described it years later as a compulsion he does not have a clean word for. Not curiosity. Something older than curiosity. The need to know what shared the mountain with them. The need to stand in the same landscape with an impossibility, until the impossibility became simply true. The second encounter came in October of 1995. All 3 brothers were together on the ridgeline above the Martins Fork drainage, setting up a deer camp for the weekend. Lonnie had been back to the mountain 4 or 5 times in the 2 years since his first sighting and had found sign each time. Tracks in the creek mud. Claw marks on a large red oak at a height no black bear in Kentucky could reach. Gouges running vertically at 6.5 feet. The spacing between them too wide for any paw print Lonnie had ever measured. Deer carcasses moved from where they had fallen, dragged distances that implied a predator far heavier than a coyote. He had shown his brothers the photographs, the track castings he had made with plaster, the measurements. Cecil had started the first notebook, but seeing evidence in photographs is different from standing on the ground where it happened, and the brothers were hunters. They needed to see it themselves. They were still setting up the camp, a canvas shelter strung between two hemlocks with a fire ring in front, when the temperature dropped sharply in the late afternoon and the wind shifted. Both things happened in a span of about 10 minutes. Cecil, who had been gathering firewood on the downhill side of the camp, stopped and walked back to where his brothers were working. He said the air had changed in a way he could not name, not a specific sound or sight he could point to. The quality of the air had changed in a way that he could not put into mechanical terms. Lonnie looked at him. Then they heard it. The sound came from below them on the slope, from the direction of the laurel thicket where Lonnie had seen the figure 2 years earlier. It was low, deeply low, the kind of frequency that registers as much in the chest as in the ears. It lasted several seconds, dropped in pitch toward the end, and then stopped. Then it came again, from a different direction, farther uphill, as if something above them on the ridge had responded. Call and answer. Unmistakable in structure. Wade, who had been 50 yards from the other two gathering deadfall, stopped moving. He said later that stopping was not a decision. His body simply refused to continue until it understood what it was hearing. The three of them stood still in their camp for approximately 10 minutes. The calls passed back and forth twice more, then stopped entirely. Cecil described what he heard to Wade that evening in the first detailed conversation the brothers had about the mountain, and wrote the same description in the first notebook. The sound had the register of a voice but not the character of one. He had heard eastern coyotes, which produce a complexity of sound that their western cousins cannot match. He had heard screech owls, great horned owls, barred owls, foxes in heat, elk bugling in Virginia. None of those sounds had the depth or the structure of what came off that hillside on that Friday afternoon. The closest comparison he could make, and he acknowledged it was inadequate, was to two men speaking in a language he could not identify, at a volume calibrated for the distance between them and for terrain that carried sound in specific ways. They found the tracks the following morning. Along the ridge trail about 150 yards from the camp, a clear series of impressions in a stretch of soft clay that spring flooding had deposited along the edge of an old logging grade running the ridgeline. The stride was consistent with what Lonnie had measured 2 years earlier, 4.5 feet between steps. 5 toes, claw marks, pad configuration that placed it firmly in the canid family at the morphological level. But the overall track, from heel to claw tip, measured 7.25 inches long. Cecil measured it 4 times with his tape, then drew it to scale in the notebook. Lonnie had brought his plaster kit. They cast 3 prints. Cecil noted in the notebook that the stride pattern changed at one point in the trackway. For about 8 feet, the pattern shifted from the separated left-right alternation of a bipedal walk to something closer together, consistent with quadrupedal movement. Then, the bipedal pattern resumed. The transition happened at a point where a fallen hemlock log crossed the logging grade. Whatever made the tracks had stepped over the log, apparently shifting its weight forward onto its hands as it crossed, then straightened back up on the far side and continued walking. Wade said that detail has stayed with him longer than almost anything else from those years. The ease of it. The transition from 2 legs to 4 and back to 2 with no apparent disruption in pace. Something that moved equally well in either posture. The brothers returned every fall. What they built across the late 1990s is best described as a working knowledge of the creature's territory, accumulated the way experienced hunters accumulate knowledge of any animal, through patient observation of sign and pattern over multiple seasons. They identified the core of the territory, a section of benchland about 2 miles long and a half-mile wide, bounded by the ridgeline on one side and the Martin's Fork drainage on the other, with the laurel thicket at the center. They found territorial markers at the edges, the claw-marked red oak on the benchland, which Cecil photographed in 1995, 1998, 2002, and 2007. A trail crossing on the upper logging grade where soil disturbances appeared fresh every fall, regardless of how long between visits. Large depressions along the ridgeline too wide and too deliberately placed to be deer beds. And twice in the mid-90s, deer carcasses deposited at the base of the marked oak with the same careful placement, necks broken in a way that Lonnie, who had processed hundreds of deer in his lifetime, said he could not replicate with his hands if he tried. By the time the elk reintroduction program brought the first animals to eastern Kentucky in December of 1997, the brothers had been documenting the Black Mountain Territory for 4 years. They noticed the elk almost immediately in subsequent seasons because the creature's territorial markers shifted slightly in response. The high-traffic benchland, which had previously served as a reliable deer concentration area, became more complex to read once elk began moving through the drainage. The territorial markers remained in the same positions. The creature's presence, measured by track density and fresh sign, did not diminish. But the prey landscape had changed around a predator that appeared to adapt its hunting strategy in response to that change. Cecil wrote in the third notebook, sometime around 2000, that the thing on the mountain was not a fixed point. It learned. If you have spent any time hunting or hiking the Black Mountain Ridgeline or the Martin's Fork drainage in Harlan County, you know the kind of terrain I am describing. The hollows are deep and the ridges are sharp, and once you are off the coal haul roads, you are in ground that sees almost no human traffic for most of the year. Let us know in the comments if you have encountered anything unusual out there, because what Wade and his brothers documented over 30 years suggests that whatever lives on that mountain has been there for a very long time. In the winter of 2001, something happened that Cecil recorded in the second notebook, and that changed the nature of their subsequent visits without ending them. Lonnie and Cecil were scouting the south face of the mountain, a section east of their usual benchland area, looking for a potential new stand location. Wade was back at the truck with a sprained ankle from a misstep on ice the previous morning. The two older brothers were moving along an old seam road, a flat shelf blasted into the hillside years earlier for coal extraction, when they found evidence that the territory extended further east than they had previously mapped, not tracks this time. What they found was what the tracks had done. A section of the seam road, 80 feet or so in length, had been crossed by something moving at a pace. The depth and spacing of the impressions suggested was significantly faster than a walk. The stride was nearly 5 feet between impacts, the claw marks driven deep enough into the mud that the individual toe pads were distinct even at that velocity. The pattern across this section was irregular, the spacing between left and right footfalls wider than what they had measured elsewhere on the mountain, as if the creature had been taking a corner or adjusting direction without slowing. At the far end of the section, the tracks went off the edge of the seam road down a slope that Lonnie estimated at 60 degrees. Not a scramble, not a brake descent. 2 long impacts in the soft material below the road edge, and then the tracks continued downslope toward the drainage. Cecil wrote 4 lines about that find. His notebook entry for the day is the shortest of any visit they made during those years. Lonnie described it to Wade at the truck that evening without inflection, the way he might have reported finding an unusual rock formation. Cecil said nothing. He sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window on the drive back to Lynch. Wade asked what was wrong. Cecil said he needed to think. That was the first time Wade noticed a division between his two brothers' relationships with the mountain. Lonnie moved through the evidence outwardly, accumulating it, cataloging it, arriving at conclusions through the same methodical process he applied to survey data. Cecil moved through it differently. He absorbed it. It accumulated in him across the years the way certain things do, layer on layer, and it did not dissipate between seasons the way physical labor does. It only deepened. 30 years of that kind of accumulation is a significant thing to carry, and Cecil carried it to his death. Wade carried it differently from both brothers. He was the youngest, which meant he came to the mountain already carrying the testimony of the other two, seeing the first evidence through their eyes before he ever saw it with his own. That framing shaped everything that followed. Lonnie and Cecil had found the thing by surprise. Wade had been told it was there before he ever set foot on the benchland, which meant the surprise was never available to him. He went to Black Mountain already knowing. What he built across 30 years was not acceptance of an impossible discovery, but an increasingly detailed picture of something whose existence he had accepted before his first encounter. He said there was a particular loneliness in that. His brothers had a before and an after, a moment of discovery that gave their experience a shape. What Wade had was an unbroken line of confirmation, year after year, and the knowing settled into him differently. The encounter in 2008 changed the character of everything that followed. It happened to Cecil alone on a Tuesday afternoon when he had gone ahead of his brothers to check trail cameras they had placed on the benchland the previous weekend. Lonnie had stayed at the truck dealing with a tire that had gone soft on the coal road. Wade had taken a different trail to check a stand he had moved earlier in the season. Cecil went to the camera stations by himself. He found the first camera on the ground. The strap that had secured it to a tulip poplar was still knotted around the trunk, but the end that attached to the camera had been pulled free. The camera housing was cracked but not destroyed. The SD card was intact. He pocketed the card, replaced the camera with a spare he was carrying, and moved to the second station. The second camera was still mounted. It had been rotated on its bracket 90 degrees, so that instead of covering the game trail crossing the benchland, it was pointing into the hillside 10 feet away. That modification required gripping the camera housing, overcoming the resistance of the mounting bracket, and holding the camera at the new angle. Cecil stood at that tree for a long time before he touched anything. He photographed the camera in its rotated position with his phone. Then he photographed the bark above and below the bracket, where a pattern of marks in the outer bark suggested something had gripped the tree at roughly 5.5 feet off the ground to reach the camera. The marks were not claw marks in the traditional sense. They were compression impressions, the bark crushed rather than raked, in a pattern consistent with fingers rather than claws. Wide-spaced, 4 of them clearly visible. The 5th less distinct, but present, on the opposite side of the trunk from the others. He was photographing the marks when he heard the breathing. He told Lonnie about it that night at camp, in the words Lonnie then repeated to Wade, and which Cecil wrote in the notebook the following morning. The breathing was close, 12 to 15 feet, he estimated. It was coming from the laurel thicket on the downhill side of the benchland, a dense wall of rhododendron that blocked sightlines to less than 3 feet. The breathing was measured and steady and large, the respiratory cycle of an animal considerably bigger than any deer. It did not change when he turned toward it. It continued at the same pace, as if whatever produced it had been watching him for a while and was entirely comfortable with his awareness of it. Cecil stood at that tree for what he described in the notebook as a long time. He said he was aware, with precision, that whatever was breathing was between him and the trail he had come in on, and that the nearest alternate route off the benchland would take him uphill to the ridgeline, and then a long walk east before he could descend to the main trail. He thought about calling for his brothers. He decided not to. He said the decision was not rational. He said calling out felt like it would change something about the situation in a way he did not want changed, that the breathing constituted a kind of steady acknowledgement between them that he would disrupt by raising his voice, and that whatever followed the disruption was not something he could predict. He walked backward along the benchland, facing the laurel thicket, for 30 yards. Then the trail curved around a stand of hemlock, and the thicket was out of sight. He turned and walked fast. He was off the benchland and moving down the main trail toward the coal road inside of 10 minutes. Lonnie saw him come around the corner of the truck and said later he knew something had happened before Cecil opened his mouth. Cecil had a way of walking when he was managing something internally that Lonnie recognized from the 2 years they had hunted together after Cecil returned from the army. Cecil sat on the tailgate for 45 minutes before he described what had happened. He had the words. He was making sure, with the precision that had defined him his whole life, that what he said was exactly what had occurred. When he finished, he said one more thing. He said he thought the thing had let him go. He said it had made a decision about him. A decision that included some degree of awareness of him as a specific individual who had been coming to this mountain for 15 years, and that the decision had been to let him leave. That was the part he could not stop thinking about. That it was a decision. Lonnie drove back to Lynch that evening without speaking. Wade sat in the back seat and watched his older brother's face in the rearview mirror. He watched the calculation running behind Cecil's eyes and understood that something had shifted in their relationship with the mountain. Not that they would stop coming. They would not stop, but they would come differently. Whatever they had believed they were doing on Black Mountain across 15 years, the creature had made clear that the observation was mutual, and whatever it had concluded about them, it had concluded without alarm. The mountain's indigenous history is the context that explains why none of this is as anomalous as it appears to someone approaching it without that background. The Cherokee, whose ancestral territory covered the Appalachian highlands of eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, and extended through the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals in 1775 into the southeastern margins of what is now Kentucky, had traditions concerning the high mountain country that the scholar James Mooney spent years documenting in the 1880s and 90s. Mooney worked under the Bureau of American Ethnology, conducting the ethnographic research that became his 1900 publication, Myths of the Cherokee, a work that remains in print and is held in university libraries across the country. In it, Mooney documented Cherokee accounts of beings associated with specific mountain territories that were understood to predate human habitation of the highlands. These were not symbolic figures in a cautionary tradition. They were described as physical presences with territorial intelligence, associated with high ridges and deep drainages, and understood through generations of coexistence to be encountered rather than confronted. The treaty that ceded the Black Mountain Ridgeline area from Cherokee to European jurisdiction did not transfer the knowledge of what lived on that ground. The eastern band of the Cherokee, who remained in the mountains of North Carolina after the removal of the 1830s, preserved those accounts. What Mooney recorded describes beings of significant size with canine features and an intelligence that the Cherokee understood in territorial rather than predatory terms. The being warned. It did not pursue. It monitored. It enforced. A man who read those passages today and then read Cecil's notebooks from 2008 would notice that the behavioral descriptions match across a gap of over a century. Earlier accounts from European settlers in the Cumberland Mountains add another layer to the record. Elias Napier was a Methodist circuit rider who traveled the eastern Kentucky mountains extensively in the 1830s and 1840s. His journals, published locally in Harlan County during the 1930s as a historical document, are held in the Kentucky State Archives in Frankfort. Napier recorded 2 accounts from settlers along the Clear Creek drainage, both from the early 1830s, of a large upright figure seen on the ridgelines at dusk. His descriptions of the settlers' reports are specific. The figure had a head like a dog and walked on 2 legs, and moved between the trees at a pace that alarmed men who were themselves experienced woodsmen. Napier dismissed the accounts as evidence of isolation and superstition, but the accounts are in the record, and the ridgeline the settlers described is the same ridgeline that the Colvin brothers returned to every fall for 30 years. The Dogman research community has been building a regional pattern for the Appalachian Highlands for over 2 decades. Linda Godfrey received Dogman accounts from this region as early as the mid-90s in her years of research. Accounts she noted were consistent with the Great Lakes pattern but carried a distinctive highland character. The witnesses were hunters, loggers, people who spent their careers in the outdoors, individuals whose credibility depended on their observational accuracy. They reported reluctantly, often years after the encounters occurred. The behavioral consistency across those accounts is difficult to dismiss. Nocturnal activity concentrated around wildlife travel corridors, territorial marking at elevated sites using trees chosen for their visibility, structured vocalizations that witnesses consistently distinguished from every known species, and a relationship with human observers that independent witnesses, separated by years and hundreds of miles, described in strikingly similar terms. The creature knew they were there, monitored them, and made a decision about them that was not aggression, but something more deliberate than that. The Colvin brothers fit every element of that Dogman behavioral profile across a territory that remained active for 3 uninterrupted decades. The consistency is not comfortable. It does not suggest a rare or isolated animal moving through unfamiliar ground and occasionally crossing paths with people. It suggests a permanent presence with a defined territory that was old when the first European settlers arrived and is still standing when you drive U.S. Route 119 north through Lynch today. The summer of 2009 brought the encounter that the brothers never fully described to each other afterward, because what each of them experienced of it was different enough that the differences themselves said something about the creature's intelligence. They were on the mountain together for a weekend in early October, before the deer season opened, running cameras and checking the territorial markers on the benchland. The weather had been dry for 10 days, unusual for October in the Cumberland Mountains, and the ground was hard enough that tracking was difficult, but the signs were fresh. The claw-marked red oak had new gouges above the 2017 marks that Lonnie had last measured, now reaching 7 feet and 4 inches. A young spike buck had been deposited at the base of the marked tree 3 or 4 days earlier based on the decomposition. 2 of the 3 trail cameras they retrieved had triggered during the nights the cameras had been running, capturing movement at the edge of the sensor range. Large bipedal movement at distance in infrared, brief clips, nothing that could be analyzed in detail but definitively present and definitively not deer or bear. They were heading back to the coal road Saturday evening, following the ridgeline trail north toward the descent, when Lonnie stopped. He stopped the way you stop when your body knows before your mind does, mid-step, and went still. Cecil and Wade were behind him on the narrow trail and stopped in response. The 3 of them stood on the ridgeline in the fading light without speaking. There were 2 of them. One was above them on the ridgeline, on the Virginia side of the summit, visible in the gap between 2 dead chestnut oaks that framed an opening of sky. It was standing, upright, motionless, with the low sun of late afternoon backlighting it against the pale October sky. At close to 200 yards, the detail was silhouette, but the silhouette was unmistakable. The head, the ears, pointed and erect, set at the top of a skull that was too elongated for any species in the regional field guide. The width of the shoulders, the length of the arms, hanging past where the hips would be on a person of that height. It was looking down the Kentucky side of the ridge, looking at them, and it did not move when they stopped. The second was lower on the slope, on the Kentucky side. Lonnie became aware of it on his left, in the timber about 70 yards off the trail, when it moved. Not quickly. It took 2 slow steps and stopped, and those 2 steps placed it at a different angle relative to the 3 brothers, and the deliberateness of the repositioning told all 3 of them the same thing at the same moment. The 2 figures had established a geometry, one above, visible on the ridgeline, holding their attention. One below, moving into a flanking position while they watched the first. Wade recognized the shape of it because he had been through some defensive driving situations in his road construction career where terrain worked the same way. 2 reference points that together control a subject's movement. These were not 2 animals that happened to be traveling in the same area. Anyone who has spent time in the Dogman research community, studying the behavioral accounts Godfrey compiled across 3 decades, would recognize the geometry. 2 individuals managing the encounter together, and the outcome of the encounter appeared to belong entirely to them. Lonnie had his rifle. He had been hunting and had not unloaded it after the morning sit. He did not raise it. He told his brothers later that raising it would have been the wrong thing to do, and he meant wrong in a specific sense that had nothing to do with moral philosophy. He said it would have ended something that needed to end differently. Cecil's hand, Wade noticed, was on the stock of his rifle for a moment. Then it was not. Cecil moved his hand back to his side, deliberately, like returning a tool to the bench after deciding it was not the right tool for the situation. The 3 brothers stood on the ridgeline trail for what Wade estimates was 5 to 8 minutes. The figure on the ridge above did not move. The figure on the slope to their left moved twice more in small adjustments, maintaining its position relative to theirs. No vocalization from either one. The silence around the encounter had the same quality the brothers had learned to recognize over 15 years on that mountain. The emptiness that moves through a forest when something at the top of the local order is present, and everything else has taken itself elsewhere. Then the one on the ridge turned, not toward them, away. Turned its back to them and walked north along the Kentucky-Virginia line, unhurried, moving through the dead chestnut oaks with a long, even gait that covered ground faster than it appeared to from a distance, until it was out of sight. The one on the slope below them was gone before any of the brothers noticed it leave. They had not seen it go. At some point between one breath and the next, the slope was empty. The brothers walked out to the coal road without speaking. They drove to Lynch without speaking. They ate dinner and sat at the table for an hour after the plates were cleared, each one bringing their own organization to what had happened, a private reckoning. When they finally talked, in the parking lot in the dark, Lonnie said there were at least 2 individuals and possibly more, which they had suspected for years but had not confirmed visually before that evening. Cecil said the one on the slope had been working through something, not the simple threat assessment of an animal registering an intruder. something more considered than that. Working through what to do, and doing the working through in real time, adjusting as the situation developed. Wade said what he was most certain about was the ending, that it had made a decision to let them leave, and that the decision was not passive. It was made the way you make a decision when you have options, and you choose among them. The restraint was chosen, and something about the fact that the restraint was chosen, rather than automatic, was the part that stayed with Wade in the weeks after, and has never entirely left. That is the distinction that does not fit any taxonomy. The creature's presence alone would not have carried this weight, and the fact of two individuals would not have been what stayed with them across the years that followed. What stayed was the decision. The range of possible actions that had to exist before a choice could be made between them is what sat with the brothers that fall and the falls that followed. Adrenaline is a biochemical response to a specific stimulus, and it fades when the stimulus is removed. What the brothers carried out of the 2009 encounter was not adrenaline. It was knowledge of a different category, with a staying power that cannot be managed or processed away. Wade described what the year after that encounter looked like for each of the three brothers, and the descriptions are notable for how different they are from each other. Lonnie, who had always been the most outwardly methodical, became more so. He spent the following winter building a spatial model of the territory from their accumulated data, plotting tracks and camera events and territorial markers on a large format topographic printout pinned to his garage wall. He said the modeling gave him somewhere to put his thoughts. He was not trying to explain the thing. He was trying to understand its geometry, its use of the terrain, the logic of how it moved through the landscape. Cecil went inward to a degree that his wife noticed, a quietness beyond his usual quiet, a tendency to stop mid-conversation and look out the window that had not been there before the 2009 October. She asked him about it twice. He did not say what he was working through. Wade, for his part, found himself driving roads at the edge of the mountain more than he had before, not going in, just circling the perimeter the way you circle a problem. You cannot bring yourself to approach directly. He said he did it without planning to, would find himself on a road that had no reason to be on his route, looking at the ridgeline through the windshield, and then drive back to town. He did this for most of that winter. Cecil's notebooks after 2009 are different from the earlier volumes. He was still systematic, still precise, still documenting what he found each October with the same discipline. But the entries are compressed. The language has a flatness that Wade, reading them after Cecil's death, interpreted not as exhaustion, but as acceptance. Cecil had moved through the phase of trying to understand and arrived at the place on the other side of it where the only work left is a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what is true. He went back to Black Mountain every October through 2014. He walked the ridgeline with his brothers, checked the cameras, photographed the territorial markers, and every year the markers were refreshed, the carcasses were placed, the cameras were rotated from their trees. It was present the way the mountain itself was present, as a permanent fact, without any remaining possibility of a different explanation. Lonnie's health declined in 2015. A cardiac event in February kept him off the mountain that fall, the first time in over 20 years that he had not been on Black Mountain in October. Cecil and Wade went without him. They found the ridgeline quieter than usual that year, the signs less fresh, as if the absence of one member of the familiar group had altered something in the encounter pattern. Cecil wrote about this in the fourth notebook. He wrote that he believed the thing on the mountain knew who they were as individuals, that it knew Lonnie the way it knew the benchland and the laurel thicket and the red oak, that the empty space where Lonnie usually walked was a space the creature could read and had read and had registered as changed. In January of 2017, Lonnie's heart gave out during a cold snap that locked Harlan County under ice for 3 days. He was 63 years old. The funeral was at a small church in Lynch, and the men who attended were miners and farmers and former coal company workers who had known Lonnie as a surveyor, a hunter, a man who knew the ground of Harlan County better than almost anyone. None of them knew what he had documented on Black Mountain for 24 years. The cabinet in his garage with the plaster casts and the photographs went to Cecil after the estate was settled, and Cecil added it to the notebooks and kept all of it in a storage unit in Benham that Wade still pays the rent on. The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources manages wildlife across the state through a structure that recognizes defined species, defined habitats, and defined management protocols. Black bears, white-tailed deer, wild turkey, eastern elk, which were reintroduced to the eastern coalfields beginning in December of 1997 through a multi-state partnership, and which have established one of the largest herds east of the Mississippi. The department's wildlife biologists are competent professionals who understand the ecology of eastern Kentucky at a level that most people never encounter. They are not careless. They are not incurious. They work within a system that was built to manage what is known, and what they manage well. They have no category for what the Colvin brothers found on Black Mountain. An undocumented large bipedal canid does not exist within the department's classification system. It cannot exist within that system, not through negligence or bad faith, but because the system was built to manage species that the scientific community recognizes. What the brothers found has no taxonomy. It has no designated habitat. It has no management protocol and no population monitoring program and no protected status, because protected status flows from classification and there is no classification for it. It exists in the space between categories, which in a resource management system is the same as not existing at all. If Lonnie had walked into the Kentucky Division of Wildlife in November of 1993 and said he had seen a large bipedal canine with a dog's head and a man's posture on the benchland above the Martin's Fork drainage, the response would have been polite. It would have included a list of alternative explanations. Large black bear observed at an unusual angle. Misidentification in low light. Perceptual distortion from fatigue or cold. The department's black bear population data for the Cumberland Mountains would have been referenced, showing a recovering population with large males capable of brief upright postures in certain circumstances. The conversation would have ended. Lonnie would have left with his reputation intact, and the cabinet of evidence would have stayed in his garage. That calculation operates the same way whether the witness is a Harlan County surveyor, an Oregon logging contractor, a Wisconsin game warden, or a military security officer in the Oregon desert. The evidence exists. The witnesses are credible. The agencies have no framework for the evidence and no incentive to develop one. And the witnesses, who understand the professional and social consequences of filing a report that falls outside any available classification, make the rational choice to stay silent. Nobody enforces that silence deliberately. The architecture of institutional knowledge enforces it by simply having no place to put evidence of this particular kind. The institutional silence around what the Colvin brothers found in Harlan County is not a suppression of anything. It is the natural result of a system designed to process the known, encountering something that does not belong to any of its categories, and filing it, by default, nowhere. Cecil understood this. He wrote about it in the fourth notebook, in an entry from 2012, with a clarity that Wade says was characteristic of the way Cecil arrived at conclusions, quietly, completely, and without drama. He wrote that the absence of official acknowledgement was not evidence that the thing was not real. It was evidence of the gap between what institutions can process and what the world actually contains. Cecil died in March of 2020 from a heart attack. He was 61 years old. He had retired from the school system 2 years earlier. He had gone back to Black Mountain the previous October, alone, because Wade had been recovering from knee surgery and Lonnie had been gone for 3 years. The notebooks from that last trip are the final entries Cecil made. He documented what he found with the same precision he had always used. Fresh marks on the red oak, now reaching what he measured at 7 feet and 7 inches. A large canid track in the mud of the creek, crossing near the benchland. A trail camera pulled from its tree and left on the ground with the SD card missing entirely, not broken and left behind but removed and taken, which was something different from anything they had encountered before. Cecil wrote a short note beside that entry. He wrote that something that removes its own documentation understands documentation. The final line of his last notebook entry is, "The oak still stands." Wade read those final entries in a hospital corridor the night Cecil died, sitting under fluorescent lights in Harlan while the doctors did what they were going to do. He read them 3 times. He said the thing that struck him most was that Cecil's last words about the mountain sounded like a goodbye that Cecil had not known was a goodbye. A man writing what he expected to continue having occasion to write, setting down what he found on a mountain he expected to return to, with a precision that had nothing valedictory in it. The last line was not an ending. It was a fact. The oak still stands. Wade went back to Black Mountain alone in October of 2021. The first time he had been there since before Cecil's death. He needed to know whether the mountain would resolve into what other people said it was once he was alone on it. Just another high point on the Virginia line, full of deer and turkey and bear and nothing else. The thing that had been real across 30 years with his brothers. Whether it was real without them. He drove the Coal Hall Road before dawn and parked at the end of it and walked the trail to the benchland in the dark, using a headlamp and moving by memory across ground he had walked more times than he could count. He reached the benchland as the light began to come in from the east. He did not need the headlamp on the flat ground. The silence found him before he found the red oak. He had not been on the benchland for 2 years, and the silence was there ahead of him the way it had always been. That particular absence of bird sound and creek movement, and the small ambient life of a functioning forest. He stopped before he consciously decided to stop. The cold October air sat still around him, and he stood in it for a moment and understood that the thing had not left when the brothers stopped coming. The thing did not leave. It was on that mountain before the Colvin brothers found it, and it was on that mountain after they were gone, and it was on that mountain right now, somewhere on the benchland or in the laurel thicket, or on the ridgeline above him, and it knew he was there. He found the red oak. The claw marks were fresh, new gouges above everything they had ever recorded before, reaching 7 feet and 9 inches by his tape measure, the highest mark that tree had ever carried. The exposed wood was pale and the resin had not darkened, which put the marks within a week of his visit. He stood at that tree with his hand on the bark, fingers in the grooves of the new marks, and felt the rough edges of the cuts under his gloves. He left one glove off and felt them with his bare skin, the way Cecil had put his hands on that same bark in 1995 and 2002 and 2007. The wood was cool in the October morning. He stayed at the benchland for about 40 minutes, long enough to photograph the marks with his phone and record the measurement in a notebook he had brought for the purpose, long enough to walk the edge of the laurel thicket and hear nothing and feel everything. The quality of the silence on that benchland is not the silence of an empty place. It is the silence of a place that is very full and very quiet, and the distinction between those two things is not something you can put into technical language. It is something you know in your body or you do not know at all. Before he left, he said something. Not loud. He said it in the register that is more intention than volume. The way you say something in a space that has been important to you for a long time. He said both his brothers were gone. He said Lonnie went first and Cecil followed, and now it was only him, and he was not coming back. He did not address the remark to anything specific. He said it in the way you say a thing that needs to be acknowledged regardless of whether any witness is present. Then he walked out to the coal road and drove back to Lynch. What do you do with what the Colvin brothers accumulated? 3 men across 30 years on a defined territory in Harlan County, Kentucky, building a documented case for the presence of something that has no place in any classification system the natural sciences currently maintain. Track casts measured to the standard that any wildlife biologist would recognize, with the documentation photographs and field notes that any field survey would require. 22 years of images of a single territorial marking tree, showing consistent refreshing of marks at a height no known eastern species can reach. Behavioral observations consistent with documented accounts from across the Appalachian region and consistent with the Great Lakes pattern that Godfrey spent 3 decades assembling. A territory mapped with sufficient precision to define its seasonal boundaries and its core use areas and its travel corridors. 4 notebooks of systematic field observation written by a man who spent 22 years developing exactly that skill as a professional function. All of it sitting in a storage unit in Benham, Kentucky, with a mid-60s road construction retiree paying the monthly rent. The gap between what that evidence documents and what the scientific community can currently receive is not a gap created by conspiracy or incompetence. It is a structural gap. The university zoology department, the peer-reviewed journal, the wildlife agency protocol, the federal survey methodology. None of these have a category for the evidence. They were not designed to receive it. Designing a system to receive it would require acknowledging, at an institutional level, that the thing the evidence documents is real, and that acknowledgement would cascade through wildlife management, land use planning, and public safety frameworks in ways that no existing institution is prepared to handle. So, the evidence waits. It has always waited. It waited through the Cherokee oral tradition and the circuit rider journals and the newspaper accounts of lumberjack encounters in the 1880s and the first wave of documented reports in the 90s. It is waiting right now, in hundreds of locked cabinets and personal storage units and password-protected hard drives held by people who saw something real and have no institutional address to send it to. The creature on Black Mountain has no comparable limitation. It is not waiting for anything. It was on that mountain before the coal companies built their haul roads into it, before the U.S. steel operation changed the human profile of the Lynch Valley, before the European settlers who pushed into Harlan County in the early 1800s arrived with their surveys and their treaties and their assumptions about what an uninhabited wilderness contained. It will be on that mountain after the coal roads return to creek beds and the benchland trail fills in with young growth, and the last person who remembers the Colvin brothers is gone. The red oak will carry new marks every year. The laurel thicket will close behind whatever enters it. The ridgeline will hold the same geometry it has held for longer than anyone can calculate. Wade said something near the end of his last conversation with us that has stayed in the room since. He said his brothers did not waste their time. He said 30 years on that mountain, building the record, keeping the notebooks, making the casts, coming back every October when it would have been easier not to, was not wasted even though nothing official will ever come of it. The thing on Black Mountain is real. His brothers knew it was real. They spent their lives confirming it, and that is the work. That is the only work any of us can do with the time we have. See the truth of the place we are in and try to put it into a form that survives us. Lonnie is gone. Cecil is gone. The notebooks are in a unit in Benham. The plaster casts are in the garage. The photographs are on Wade's phone and on a backup drive he keeps in a fireproof safe under the bed. And on the benchland above the Martins Fork drainage in Harlan County, Kentucky, a dogman that was there before the maps were drawn moves through the October dark on the same trails it has always used, marking the same tree, enforcing the same boundaries. It has no interest in documentation or acknowledgement. It does not need us to confirm its existence any more than the mountain itself does. The oak still stands on that benchland above Lynch and Benham. The marks grow a little higher each year. And whatever made them will still be making them long after the last person who remembers this story has closed their eyes for the last time in the dark.